Just as a matter of interest to those of you who are signers of the Reformation Day statement, during the break I returned a call to World Magazine down in Asheville, and World Magazine has refused to publish the statement, even though it has been signed by such men as R.C. Sproul, D. James Kennedy, Gleason Archer, Robert Raymond, and many of the people in this room. And I talked to the young lady who was sent by the publisher to make the phone call and asked that she send me a letter stating their refusal to publish the advertisement, the Reformation Day statement, and she said she would do so. So it seems that every year about this time, World Magazine comes through with another great triumph. Last year, of course, as you recall, for those of you who were here last year, they, in their editorial comments, they attacked our ad in the magazine for our conference last year. And it was a completely benign ad. It announced the name of the conference and the titles of some of the papers. And they attacked it editorially. World is seriously compromised. I hope you're getting this on tape, Mike. World is seriously compromised. It uses the books of William Bennett to promote its subscriber list. William Bennett is, of course, the chairman of the Catholic Campaign for America and one of the most glib representatives of the papacy in the United States. And it's his books that are promoted by World Magazine, and apparently they are afraid of offending their Roman Catholic readers by publishing documents such as the Reformation Day statement. We will, of course, pursue our options after this. We did have a contractual agreement with World to publish the ad, and what we do from this point forward, we will have to consider. Now, having said that, let's get back to the matter of economics. This hour, Dr. Ronald L. Cooper, not Dr. Ronald E. Cooper. Ronald E. Cooper couldn't make it here, so Ronald L. came. Dr. Ronald L. Cooper is going to be talking to us about the failure of secular economic policy. I talked last hour about the failure of secular economic theory. Dr. Cooper, or Ron as he likes to be called, comes from California, Moraga, California. I met him for the first time about 4 or 5 years ago. At the time, he was on the faculty of Biola University in Southern California, and I was living in New Mexico, and he invited me out to give some lectures to the faculty, which I gladly did, but shortly thereafter, his job terminated. And I don't know if there was a cause and effect relationship between those two events or not, Ron. But Ron was an outstanding man on the faculty at the university. He had grasped what Christianity was about and what the implications it had for the field of economics. And he was trying to enlighten his peers as well as his students at the university. He's had a tremendous amount of experience. He's been trained as an economist and as a mathematician. Of course, to get a degree in economics proper, you have to be a mathematician. That is a terminal degree in the United States. Those who can't do the math or don't like math get a degree somewhere else. They don't go through an economics program at a major university. They go through a history program or some other field, but they don't get an economics degree. So if any of you have any math questions, Ron's the one to ask. Although he has described himself as a former mathematician. I don't know if one is a former mathematician, though. He used to work for the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, besides working for the Department of the Treasury in Saudi Arabia. One of his duties there, I think, was to advise the Saudis on how to invest their money. And he is widely read, has a great deal of experience, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy his presentation on the failure of secular economic policy. Ron?
Thanks, John. First of all, I think I should start with an apology, because when John first asked me to present 2 papers, it was quite some time ago, and there was plenty of time to do the papers, so I said fine, it would be no problem. But unfortunately, the way things go and sometimes in your life, the last 2 months, something unexpected came up and took most of my time, and so I rapidly cranked out the 2 papers and realized, number one, they were way too long for the conference. Number 2, they need to be polished and refined and contain some errors, so I apologize for that right up front. But I hope that still, despite those shortcomings, that the talk will be of some benefit to you. Before I start, say that when I got my graduate training at Berkeley, I was trained to be a scientist, and I did everything but wear a lab coat, but I thought about it. So that was my approach to economics, that I was trained to be a mathematician, a statistician. We go out, collect data, test hypotheses, just like any other operating science. And my PhD thesis was to take all of the existing macroeconometric models of the U.S. economy, and at that time there was a lot of excitement over this, which I'll go into in a few minutes, and to actually construct a test of all the models and see how well they predict, and also to see if they're structurally stable over time. And this was a massive undertaking involving about 300 time series, working 7 hours a day in the computer center at Berkeley. In fact, it was the same building Ted Kaczynski was in. I don't know if there's any correlation there. I did see him at that time, but never dreamed that, what would happen subsequent to that. Right, he was a mathematician too. So there's some relationship between mathematics and insanity, but I don't know what it is, I guess. So anyway, it took me about 2 years to complete this work. It was such a massive undertaking, and I did have some help from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and a lot of good advice, at least I thought it was good advice, from my thesis advisor, Dale Jorgensen, I guess, who's now at Harvard and up for the Nobel Prize. That the conclusion of my study was disturbing, and I remember my advisor said to me, I said, "You think all this work will mean anything to anybody?" And he says, "Oh, I think it's going to have an impact." And the conclusion of my study was that all of the models were basically unstable and could not predict any better than simple mechanical forecasting schemes. That was the conclusion of my paper. And I was invited to the National Bureau of Economic Research at Harvard to present the results of my thesis at an NBER seminar, and it's interesting that the meeting took place in the Ames courtroom. So all the models were on trial in the courtroom, and the conclusion was they were all convicted. So I thought that was kind of neat that where the meeting took place. But after my thesis, I immediately became very disillusioned with the whole field of economics and econometrics, which is applying statistics to economics, and really didn't know quite where I stood. And after spending all this time working in this area, and then so what I did, I really became involved more in the energy field and moved off into engineering and other areas for quite a while before I came back to economics. And it was only after reading some articles by a few of the theonomists, I won't mention any names at this point, they're more notorious I think today, but a few of the theonomists like Gary North, and also then I began to read Gordon Clark. And Gordon Clark, more than anybody else, changed my whole thinking about science and the whole methodology, epistemology, and metaphysics was due to Gordon Clark. Anyway, with that opening, let me proceed. Today I want to talk about the failure of economic policy. If we look at the public policies of governments, where they come from somewhere. And where they come from, they're derived from the theoretical and empirical work of mainstream economics. And anybody that's ever taken a course in economics or college or has children have done that realize that my economics is bifurcated into two categories, microeconomics and macroeconomics. And the former tries to analyze economic behavior at the individual firm, household, and industrial level, and while the latter studies economic aggregates, such as the GDP, government expenditures, and taxes, money supply, interest rates, things you read in the Wall Street Journal every day. There are dozens of economic journals that pour out multitudes of articles giving the latest empirical results, however, with constantly changing implications for public policy. So you always have to keep up with the journals to find out what's the latest thing we think we know. An interesting big meeting in Washington took place in 1988. The National Research Council, I believe, which is associated with the National Science Foundation, had a large meeting on the social sciences. And there was a report of a committee there, and the committee said the scope, rigor, and importance of the behavioral sciences has grown steadily. However, they were not able to point to any specific increase in knowledge that had been acquired in the social sciences. However, they really thought the main concern was the lack and decrease of government funding was the main problem. Now, to correctly analyze public policies, it requires that we talk a little bit about the methodologies of mainstream macroeconomics and microeconomic theory. So that's what I want to do now. So let me discuss a little bit about macroeconomics. In this brief talk, I can't go into much detail. It would probably be too boring for you anyway. But let me just hit the highlights of macroeconomics and microeconomics. If we start with macroeconomics, what we find today is many competing paradigms or many competing schools of thought. The dominant school of thought in the 20th century really has been the Keynesian model, emanating from the work of John Maynard Keynes in his concluding opus, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936. Supposedly was to explain the high unemployment rate both in England in the 1920s and the 30s and in the U.S. in the 30s. That why does unemployment stay so high? And his conclusion was that the whole economy is basically internally unstable, that there's something inherent in markets that causes massive failures. And these massive failures cause unemployment, and so we can have what's called, in the terminology of the field, equilibrium of unemployment levels, at 10%, 20%, and so on. Although he never defined what he meant by equilibrium. Anyway, that's the basic notion of Keynes, and Keynes believed that it took careful policies of government. Because of this instability of the economy, we need macro policies such as spending and taxing decisions on the part of the Congress, and also correct monetary policy on the part of the Federal Reserve System to guide the economy through time, to keep it stable, to prevent fluctuations in business activities, to prevent unemployment and inflation. And so Keynes really saw himself as the savior of capitalism. He didn't see himself as a socialist in any way. He saw himself as a savior. And now Keynes did not go unchallenged, and it was in the 1950s where another school of thought or another paradigm began to emerge from the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. And their basic contention was that economies are stable, that markets are stable, But what the problem is, it's bad monetary policy. In other words, the Federal Reserve System inflates the money supply too fast, causing a boom in inflation, and it steps on the brakes too hard, causing unemployment and recession. So the solution to the problem is to have monetary policy have a steady increase in the money supply so that everything works out just fine. The economy goes to a steady growth path. Other schools arose that didn't buy into that paradigm. The new classical school is another school that arose in the 80s, and basically their contention was that depressions are impossible. It was one of the conclusions of their model. So they sort of blotted out the 1930s and said that it couldn't happen. Another school of thought came up, which was the real business cycle theory, really going back to the famous German economist Joseph Schumpeter's theory of innovations. It's fluctuations in innovations that generate business cycles, and the real business cycles theory went back to his. Again, this is an internal generation of business cycles within the economy. So both the real business cycle and the Keynesian were in a camp in one sense, that it was internally generated, but the reasons were different. The Keynesian model really, the culprit was business investment. Because of all the uncertainty in business investment, businessmen don't want to invest, or we have a fall in demand or something like that, and then that causes the recession. Let's see. Now, let me move on to just a brief history of econometrics. And you watch my time, so I won't go. Okay. Because econometrics is the sort of the queen of economics. It's a tool that was invented to match the real world with economic theory, and it was really developed in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, beginning largely with the work in the Cowles Commission, which started in Colorado and then quickly moved to the University of Chicago under the leadership of mathematician Professor Jacob Marshak. There were some Dutch mathematicians and economists there also that participated in this. And by the 1950s, because of this work, econometrics began to dominate the field of economics. It provided a framework for solving simultaneous equations. It became a framework for discovering the true economic models, which is what they started with in their epistemology. It really also was the answer to being able to predict the future. So there was increasing optimism about the role of econometrics within economics. And however, and particularly throughout the 60s, it was believed that models could finally be developed that could predict business cycles. And once we can predict business cycles, then we can develop the appropriate policy to prevent business cycles. Now, the optimism was fairly short-lived because in the 1970s, many of the Keynesian models could not predict the events that were happening, such as increasing unemployment and inflation at the same time. And, of course, this is another thing that spurred on other schools of thought, other paradigms as well. And largely within macroeconometrics, the basic idea here was to become an eclectic model. That if the Keynesian model doesn't work, we'll bring in this other paradigm and kind of merge the two together and come out with an eclectic model. It's sort of like Roman Catholicism. It brings everything in. If somebody's got a challenge out there, and bring it on into the church and keep it there, and then incorporate it into your system. And that's really the state of macroeconomics today. It's an eclectic system that includes several schools of thought in some kind of a framework that nobody understands. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that besides serving as a scientific discipline for searching for true models, econometrics has also been used as a marketing tool to persuade planners and policymakers that accurate predictions of the future can be made. And while outsiders to the economics profession might think that econometricians build models using some sort of objective methodology, they would not be correct. The typical models are run through dozens of different functional forms using the same data until the model is able to track an historical time series closely. Only the final results of the models are either published or sold to business and government planners. One trick that is often used to improve the fit of the model to historical data is to supplement the estimation of the model with time series estimation procedures. And this is really interesting because these time series procedures are based on German historicism. And it was during the 1920s and 30s that one economist by the name of Wesley Clare Mitchell studied business cycles with non-econometric means, but his idea was to find indicators that would predict business cycles. He based his methodology and epistemology on German historicism. He was radically criticized by the Cowles Commission econometricians because they said you're doing measurement without theory and that's nonsense. It's not professional. It's not acceptable. And now econometric models have brought back in the German historicism in the form of these statistical time series analysis back into the analysis. So now German historicism is now welcome in macroeconometrics again. The second point that should be made about econometrics is there is no unique methodology. One method of estimation is the Bayesian estimation. The second method is classical estimation. Classical estimation assumes that there's underlying true parameters and you've got to find them. While Bayesian estimation says the parameters are random but the data is given. So it's a different methodology completely. There is no unique methodology in econometrics. The investigator chooses the method. In addition to that, there's an infinite number of mathematical algorithms for estimating econometric models. And the probability of choosing the correct method, I got this from John, is zero. That idea. So I'm plagiarizing John. Now let's take a look at the macroeconometric models, the historical record, and also take a look at some of the critics. If we look at a basic assumption of models is that there's a stable relationship among the economic aggregates. Without stable relationships, accurate prediction of future movement of economic aggregates, such as GDP, interest rates, inflation, employment, etc., are not possible. The record of macroeconometric models reported in the economic literature indicates that structural change is the rule rather than an exception. I wrote another paper where I summarized some of these studies in more detail. I don't have time to talk about it today. But basically, they all came to the same conclusion that I did, that all the models are structurally unstable. If they're structurally unstable, then they're not useful in prediction. Now, let's see. Another outcome of the disappointing results of these models over the last 30 to 40 years has also resulted in econometricians revising their official epistemological and metaphysical foundations. In the 1930s and 40s, econometrics adopted the strict philosophy of logical positivism that there were true underlying models of human behavior that can be discovered by empirical investigation. And more recently, econometrics has largely switched its official epistemology to the philosophy of Karl Popper. And John mentioned Friedman, who despite his quote on positivism, I believe follows Karl Popper's philosophy, in which true models can never be identified, only falsified through hypothesis testing. Now, regarding the verification of models, just quoting Karl Popper, he says, "Now, in my view, there's no such thing as induction. Thus, inference to theories from singular statements, which are verified by experience," and then he says, in parentheses, these are his words, "whatever that may mean, is logically inadmissible. Theories are therefore never empirically verifiable." Now, however, despite the official Popperian position on econometrics, it's rare that economists follow the rules of their methodology. Because of the pressure to publish positive results for academic promotion, rather than the negative results, nobody wants to read something that doesn't work, data mining activities are used, and numerous computer runs are used to get good-fitting models Rather, they do not use the rules of hypothesis testing. There are certain rules, and they don't use them. Another factor is that most of the economic journals are controlled by small groups of academic tenured editors and gatekeepers who accept articles for publication, only those which fit into the mainstream paradigms. And these usually include articles of the Keynesian/neoclassical variety. Articles that use other epistemologies and methodologies, such as the Austrian method that John talked about this morning, are rarely accepted for publication in economic journals. They're considered to be non-scientific, and they're not accepted. The famous Ludwig von Mises, again, that John referenced this morning, said the error in the field, according to Mises, is that it not only mistakenly tries to relate economic aggregates to one another statistically, but also errs in treating the whole economy if it's some sort of giant organism that acts on its own, independently of the individuals who make it up, thus being subject to the fallacy of aggregation. Now, it's interesting sometimes there's an admission by economists as to the state of the so-called economic science. And here's a good one. In 1998, there was a conference on business cycles that took place at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, involving some of the leading economic researchers in the U.S. And the reason for the conference was, one, the long unexplained expansion of economic growth in the 90s, whereas the average recessions or expansions were about 4 years. This one lasted for almost a whole decade. And second was the recent financial and cyclical problems in the various Asian countries. And the third reason was the protracted economic downturn in Japan. Now, using the latest econometric modeling techniques, the causes of historical business cycles in the U.S. and other countries were investigated. And the results of the studies were published in a book. And in the forward comment by the president of the Federal Reserve Bank, Kathy Minahan, she says, on concluding about the papers on the conference, our inability to pin down the source of some of the most important events in economic history seems to me a gaping hole in the intellectual underpinnings of modern macroeconomics. So after studying business cycles for 100 years, economists still have no clue. Macroeconomic theory coupled with econometrics has been a dismal failure in producing any useful results that could aid decision makers and planners in guessing about the future state of the economy. And however, despite the fact that this is correct, the Keynesian model is still continued to be taught in all college macroeconomic courses, including, sad to say, almost all Christian colleges as well. The Keynesian model is presented as the point of departure, where other schools of thought are then talked about. It's always the starting point, is the Keynesian model. And I guess we can speculate as to why that's true. One reason is, I think, economists at colleges, universities, they're supported by tax dollars. If there were no public tax-supported institutions, the Keynesian model would have disappeared a long time ago. But I think they have a vested interest in promoting the idea of Keynesian model because it promotes the idea of the necessity of government intervention, and it also justifies the need for research grants to study economics and economic policy. The second possible reason is that the notion of massive market failure is also used to justify not only fiscal and monetary policy for the economy, but a whole range of social do-good projects that legislators and government bureaucrats wish to pursue. Now, let me talk just briefly about what I consider measurement madness in economics. If we look at the Wall Street Journal and the TV financial commentators like CNBC, we see that they're obsessed with the latest macroeconomic numbers that come out of Washington for clues on the state of the economy. Market traders with their fingers on the buy or sell button wait nervously for the latest index numbers on inflation, productivity, and economic aggregates, such as the trade balance. However, the problem is the interpretation of the indicators keeps changing all the time. At one time, an indicator might mean something, but then we're told later it might mean something else. And So we have that problem of the floating interpretation of what the indicator means. And I could go in a lot more detail, but I don't have time. One of the index numbers that's widely quoted is the so-called consumer price index. It gives a mistaken impression that when the index goes up by 10%, that means that all prices of final goods and services have increased uniformly by 10%, which is not true. And another trick that's played, and I think this was the political influence from Washington, is that if the indicator shows that inflation is increasing too much, it makes people nervous, then you find the pieces that are causing the indicator to go up, and then you take them out. And then you redefine the index as core inflation. So, and the two indicators that are the two prices that are taken out are energy and food, because they tend to go up more than the other prices. And now you have core inflation is lower, so we can now relax a little bit because we've taken the bad guys out of the index. There's an infinite number of ways of constructing index numbers. Examples: Spears, Fisher, Divizia, on and on and on. There's an infinite number. There's no index number that measures price inflation. The consumer price index measures the price of nothing. Now, along with these other indicators that are developed, particularly the national income and product accounts, they were developed largely by Simon Kuznets in the 1930s and 40s. This was a system of national accounts to try to measure how the economy is doing. And it started with the GNP and was redefined to GDP, which is almost the same thing. But to try to look at these indicators, and also they were tailored to the Keynesian model. The indicators were national income account variables were put together along the guidelines of the Keynesian model. And I'll explain that more in a minute. The question is, though, do the measures measure the well-being of the society? And let's consider the GDP. When people volunteer their time rather than working to earn money to help others who are in need, they are substituting non-monetary for monetary activities. Volunteer activities are bad because they cause the GDP to go down. However, when a group of demon-possessed students go into a school and start a massacre, then police and SWAT teams are called into action, working overtime, ambulances are called, extra doctors and nurses are called into work, memorials are planned, coffins and flowers are ordered, giving a nice boost to the GDP. The GDP reflects the commitment of economists to utilitarian philosophy in which everything that is important can be measured in monetary terms. And there was a professor at Princeton, Oscar Morgenstern, also a mathematician, who evaluated the national income and product accounts, and he said basically his conclusion was that they're embarrassingly inaccurate. We have many problems. One of them is a so-called shadow economy, where 15% of the GDP in rich countries cannot be measured, and then it might be as high as 30 to 40% in the emerging economies. The size of the underground economy seems to be positively related to the size of tax rates and the amount of government regulation. And another serious error in the national income accounts is the way they're defined. I mentioned before they were defined along the lines of the Keynesian model. And the Keynesian model really focuses on consumption and demand as being the driving force of the economy. And so the way the accounts are defined is they have the concept of value added, which means that they take the business sector and subtract out all the intermediate purchases that businesses make, that they're not included in the GDP. And that gives the impression that the household sector of consumption is like 4 times higher than larger than the business sector. And you see this bias in policy measures. There's always tax cuts for consumers, but do nothing for business. And it's based on an erroneous definition of numbers that makes the business sector appear to be smaller than the household sector, but in fact it's the exact reverse. The business sector is actually 1/3 larger than the household sector when you take into account intermediate purchases. But the government does not collect data on intermediate purchases except about every 10 years. Let's see. I'm going to skip some of this because it's too much. Let me talk a little bit about economist myths and inventions. I mentioned before that Keynes thought himself as a savior, and not only did he think himself as a savior, his students thought of him as a savior. Nobel laureate Lawrence Klein, he's probably retired now, he's an old man now, but he was at the University of Pennsylvania for a long time, and he led the Wharton School in Economics, and they had a very prestigious economic forecasting group and a large macroeconometric model that they sold projections and had a large group of corporate clients. And in fact, after I completed my dissertation at Harvard, or presented the results of my dissertation, Lawrence Klein called me up and demanded that I come back to the University of Pennsylvania and debate him because they didn't like what I was saying. And some of his clients were at the same Harvard meeting where I presented my paper. So I did that, and we had a debate, and I really don't know how the debate ended, but I didn't give any ground, and I don't think he appreciated me very much. So anyway, but anyway, Lawrence Klein said this, and Lawrence Klein is considered to be one of the fathers of modern econometrics as well, and also the application of mathematics to economics. He said, Keynes has been stressed as not radical. He wanted to reform capitalism in order to make it work better and preserve it. How is it possible that any capitalist could object to a policy of the preservation of capitalism? And that's what Lawrence Klein said. So, again, Keynes is looked upon as some kind of a savior of the system. Now, another popular one popular myth in macroeconomics, and it's accepted in all textbooks. If you look, they just accept it without question. That is that you absolutely have to have a central bank to manage the money supply, to prevent inflation, and to keep the economy on a stable growth path. Now, one of the problems that the so-called monetarists, they're the ones that emphasize monetary policy from the University of Chicago under Friedman, ran into was over the definition of money. There's M1, which is just currency and demand deposits. M2 includes time deposits. M3, some other financial assets. And then the question is, where do you stop? What is money? And as Gordon Clark has told us over and over, if something it means everything, it means nothing. So, will the real money supply stand up? Now, some economists have suggested that the Fed watch other indicators and to try to manage the economy, but there really is no conclusion. We see on NBC, Alan Greenspan every couple of weeks staggers out of his temple to check the wind of the economy and then goes before Congress to tell what he knows. But that's about all we know about it. Macroeconomics refuses to face the fact that the central bank, in combination with the fractional reserve banking system, is the cause of all monetary instability in business cycles. And it's really amazing that the pagans, Austrian economists, have known that for a long time. The classical economists knew that for a long time, but modern macroeconomics does not recognize that. They see the central bank, rather than the cause of the problem, as an institution that's necessary for stability. Now, how much time do I have? Okay. Now let me switch the discussion to microeconomics. The reigning model in microeconomics is the neoclassical model. The microeconomics has not split itself as much into different paradigms as the macroeconomic model has. And there's more agreement among economists about the neoclassical model in microeconomics than there is in macroeconomics. Now, the problem with the microeconomic model is it's based on a logical fallacy. And let me explain what I mean. The modern microeconomic model is really based on the work of Irving Fisher at Yale University in the early 20th century. And what Irving Fisher did was he applied mathematics and economics, and I'm sure he borrowed things from Jevons and other people, as well. All of his thesis advisors were engineers and physicists, Irving Fisher. And so what he did was he took the physics-mechanics model and he brought it over into economics and just redefined the terms. So, and this was pointed out by, this is not original with me by any means, Philip Murawski, in a book called More Heat Than Light, has explained this in great detail. And it may be difficult for somebody who has not had some training in physics to understand what he's saying, but he says it very clearly. And he says it was the physics metaphor that was used to define the neoclassical model. This is what Irving Fisher did. The variables in the physics model were magically transformed into those of the neoclassical model, with the metaphysical particle being the individual, space becomes the commodity space, force becomes marginal utility and disutility. In the physics model, kinetic and potential energy change, but the total energy of the system is constant under the assumption of conservation of energy. By the way, physicists don't believe that anymore, if you know anything about quantum mechanics. This assumption in the physics model translates into the corresponding assumption in the neoclassical economic model, that total utility plus total income is a constant. Now I got to go back a second in order to explain what I'm talking about. Before 1900, there was a notion that at least some of utility was measurable. Maybe not all of utility, but some of utility was measurable. By utility, I mean what is useful to people, is the way economists define utility. And they referred to this as cardinal utility. And this really came from the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, who believed that pleasure and pain could actually be measured. So it's based on utilitarian philosophy.
Please turn the tape over at this point.
Then the notion was basically given up with the work, I believe, of Karl Menger from the Austrian school and some other economists, that they switched that notion to what is called ordinal utility. By ordinal, I mean ranking. You could rank preferences of people, but you can't measure them. Now, the problem with the neoclassical model is if utility is ordinal, you cannot measure it. Then what they're doing in this assumption, if you bring the physics model over to the economics, you've got to bring it all. Because if you throw away the energy of conservation equation from the physics model, the model is nonsense. It doesn't make sense anymore. So if you bring it over, you got to bring all of it over. And so the assumption in the neoclassical model is that you're adding a ordinal variable to a cardinal variable, which is nonsense. All the demand curves and so on, the law of demand that's derived in the neoclassical model cannot be done. It's based on a contradiction. You have to assume that you can measure utility. And they've never gotten out of that box. The assumption is buried. If you look in the mathematical economics textbooks, they'll put it in a footnote. It's called the integrability problem. And it's always buried in a footnote. They don't want to talk about it. And I don't blame them. The only use that I can think for the neoclassical model is a possible sequel to Alice in Wonderland. The ideal, another problem with the neoclassical model is this notion of perfect competition, this imaginary model in which we have millions of firms. Nobody has any influence over price. Firms are all selling identical products. They're the size of mom-and-pop grocery stores. And this model is used as a standard to measure whether competition exists or not. And the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission uses this standard, which is something that doesn't exist. It's not even relevant to anything, but yet it's used for antitrust purposes. I'm getting short of time. 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to cut out most of that. The problem here is also used in in defining terms in the micro model. What does monopoly mean? I think that came up yesterday in the discussion. Monopoly originally had a negative connotative term. It was applied to in Europe to firms that got exclusive trade privileges. and there was no competition was allowed. That was the original intention. But now it's being applied to a voluntary market situation, and there's some kind of nefarious behavior that's implied that can go on when any firm becomes large enough to have a little control over its price. Then it becomes a potential monopoly. And if you really believe that, then you have to say that there's inherently something wrong with voluntary exchange. And we need to dig into that and find out what's wrong with it. I'm going to skip some of this because I'm running out of time. I want to make one comment on doing empirical nonsense. I mentioned the journals. The economic journals are just in a state of chaos. What you find is a continual refutation of previous results. My thesis advisor said the way he was getting to Harvard, and he made it, was you pick out the guy that's got the leading theory and you show it as it's a special case, and you show that your theory predicts better than his, and he made his way to Harvard. And that's the way you get on top. So it's just a continual refutation of somebody else's results. Always searching for knowledge but never finding it. And just want to give this one example. The endless debate that goes on among economists involved in empiricism is what causes what. Most empirical economic studies show that the health of people in developing countries improves, and Cal Beisner he's got probably have something to say about this. So that's good. Improves only after their income and wealth per person increases significantly, and it is wealth that drives health. However, a recent demographer, Nicholas Eberstadt, a demographer of the American Enterprise Institute, disputes this long-believed conclusion in a study of Russia. He concludes is that the declining health in Russia has caused the GDP per capita to go down. It's health that drives wealth. So you get the idea. Okay, another endless debate is over things like the minimum wage, and this is really upsetting because it's long been believed that by economists almost unanimously, when we raise the minimum wage, it causes unemployment. But David Card and Alec Kruger in a recent study say no. They looked at some data in New Jersey in the fast food industry, and they found that if you raise the minimum wage, employment goes up. And of course, Congress likes to quote that study to justify increasing the minimum wage. The main reason why secular economics fails is because of empiricism. It's a fatal error of empiricism. It's impossible to establish any truth through any form of the use of the scientific method, whether in economics or physics. Second, empirical econometrics, particularly macro, provides not even any useful information. And then, as a final comment, I should mention, besides the stumbling block of there's actually two other stumbling blocks for developing Christian economic theory that I see. One is, and this is what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, Christian economists approve of using secular economic theory and methods, and also the prominent theologians of our day, like Norman Geisler and R. C. Sproul, believe in natural theology, that you can obtain knowledge a body of knowledge apart from Scripture. And as John already mentioned, they appeal to Aquinas as their authority. And also, I should also mention Ron Nash does the same thing. And also, Ron Nash, a theologian, doesn't believe you can develop any economics, positive economics, from the Bible. And in conclusion, I'll say, let me say something about Gordon Clark. Gordon Clark has demonstrated that all these arguments do not lead to the God of the Bible. And the theologians like Sproul and Nash and Geisler, they mistakenly believe that if you reject natural theology, we have no basis of dealing with non-Christians, and also this means you have to accept fideism. And Gordon Clark rejected both natural theology and fideism. He begins presuppositionally with the Bible, the starting point for all knowledge, including economics. Yeah. I'll take anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Yes, sir.
You said that central bank in combination with the fractional reserve banking system is the cause of all monetary instability in
Right.
the cycle.
Right.
Can you explain that in very simple terms? Is that just by tinkering with the interest rates?
Well, in part, it's the problem is that there's a certain amount of goods in the economy, and there's actually a law that I can show right out of Scripture called, it's been renamed as Say's Law, which says that if there's an increase in the demand for a commodity, there already has to be preceded by that an increase in the supply of another commodity. That's what Say's Law says, and that's the way economics works. The problem with two problems here. One is that the central bank has the ability to monetize the deficit of government anytime it feels like it. It may not do it this year, it could do it next year. They have the ability to buy federal government securities and print their own money. So it's just a sophisticated way of printing money. They could just print it directly and not bother with the bonds and avoid the expense of the bonds, but they decide to do it this way. And most people don't realize what's happening because, by the time you see the effects of increasing the money supply on the economy, there's a lag effect, and you always blame it on something else, speculators or whatever. The other problem is with the commercial banking system. It's based on a fractional reserve system, which means that you can inflate the money supply, you can inject purchasing power into the economy without there being first an increase in the supply of a commodity. And the reason there's a moral problem there too, because really what you're doing when the bank creates money to make a loan, what it's doing is it's issuing, in effect, multiple claims on the same assets. In any other industry, a person would be in jail for doing that, but banks get away with it. So there's a moral reason behind it, but that inflation of the money supply, and also they only have to hold a certain amount of reserves in the bank, so they can multiply their deposits through the banking system in a multiple fashion, creating a large boom in the economy, and that's why you see business cycles. The reason you haven't seen the business cycle, the downturn in the U.S., it's going to happen, but because we've exported overseas. You've seen it in Japan. You've seen the sickness in Japan, and you've seen it in Asia. It always comes back at some point. It causes malinvestment. It does affect interest rates, lowers them artificially, causes businesses to make bad planning decisions. And the recession is as the Austrians correctly point out, that's the time necessary to correct for the malinvestment that took place during the boom. And the monetary system is a satanic monetary system. It's under the kingdom of Satan. It's not a biblical system. There's no place in the Bible for a central bank. It's unnecessary because money in the Bible is treated as a physical commodity like every other commodity. The only thing it says is to be treated with fair weights and measures like any other exchange. Also, there's a confusion about, I'm building your question, there's a confusion about barter. Most economists, and typical definition of barter is that it's exchange without money, but that's incorrect. And that's a bad definition. And the reason it's bad is because as soon as you separate money from other commodities, then you have to come up with a theory of money. What barter does, it makes exchange efficient by lowering transaction costs. All exchanges are barter. And economists need to get their heads on straight to realize that. I didn't mean to get off your point, but did I answer your question? Okay.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, sir.
How do you make money a commodity when today's money is based on index?
Today's money is artificial. We don't have a biblical monetary system. And as Christians, we need to work peacefully to change our institutions, to get back to a biblical system. In Genesis chapter 2, God talked about gold and other precious metals being approved of. And we see in Genesis right away that money is being used in exchange. The division of labor, the dominion command of the earth could not be carried out without money. This was given by God at the creation. Money is a necessary tool for carrying out God's dominion commandment. And what man has done is substitute an artificial money so that governments can inflate the money supply and pursue the projects they want and grab the resources they want to do it by bidding them away from other uses, and also causing people, and then this ends up in the recessions and the booms. Yes, sir.
What is the layman to make of all the federal government claims, such that they're all contradictory, such that, say, for instance, we now have a balanced budget, or these sorts of things? John, you were yesterday with the shady bookkeeping. Any comments there?
Well, one of the John is correct. I mean, the Social Security program, in the first place, is just a pyramid scheme and a tax system, as John correctly pointed out yesterday. But they don't. When they say balanced budget, they don't take into account the money they've robbed out of the Social Security trust fund. Again, anybody else would be in jail for doing that. The government gets away with it. There's also this notion that we look at price inflation, and we say, oh, look how low it is, so everything must be fine. But the government has been inflating the money supply through the fractional reserve banking system tremendously. This same thing happened in the 20s. We saw low inflation, and finally we got the bust. It always ends up in a bust. It's just a question of when. And which prices go up may be a function of what's in the price index. The stock market goes up, but that part of that inflation is a lot due to the increase in the money supply. It's an artificial increase. And whenever there's an artificial increase, there's going to be a correction at some point. And don't ask me to say when, because I don't know. Yes, sir.
Since you said the banks artificially control, or they don't control, but are the cause of inflation and recessions and depressions.
In part, in combination with central bank, yes.
Does that mean necessarily that the inflationary periods and recessionary periods planned, possibly, or was that where they kind of just messed up?
I don't think they're planned. I don't think bankers have some conspiracy. I think individual bankers don't really see the whole process of what's going on. The only plan that I can see is by Satan. Satan plans it, because what does Satan want to do? He wants to destroy the Dominion Command. He wants to keep people in poverty. And what's the best way to do that? Cause a big depression and recession. We often forget that in economics we have a spiritual battle as well. There's two manifestations of the battle. One is in the physical realm, one is in the spiritual realm. And Satan, who is the god of this world, temporarily controls a lot of things. And unfortunately, he's controlling the monetary system at the moment. And whether we'll ever have a biblical system, I'm not optimistic about it, but at least we need to know the truth, and it also gives Christians a standard. Biblical economics gives Christians a standard for comparing all other economic theory. And that's also part of discipleship. That's how that's how countries raise themselves out of poverty, by using biblical principles. If Japan was successful at all, they were using some biblical principles, whether they appreciated or recognized it or not. And they probably didn't. Yes, sir.
If I could just follow up on what you just said, to some extent, Japan's leaders back in the turn of the century perhaps did recognize the difference to the application of biblical principles in Japan. Are you familiar with the Iwakura mission?
Not really.
Essentially, it was the Japanese, having thought themselves to be the children of the sun, and the S-U-N of God, therefore the highest form of human beings, were really puzzled about how the West had gotten so rich compared to themselves. And the government, the imperial government, appointed a commission of financiers, bankers,
I remember that.
Government leaders to tour around the West and figure out what made the West so rich. When they came back, of course, they talked about things like comparative advantage and factory systems and so on. But what they said were the most important things were certain moral assumptions quite contrary to those that were strong under Shinto and Buddhism, and they acknowledged that the moral assumptions were promoted by Christianity so prevalent in the West, and the government explicitly took steps to inculcate those new moral assumptions in Japan, and that led very quickly to the enormous growth of Japan's economy in the 1890s through 1920s.
Great point.
And a very similar thing happened after World War II.
Right, with MacArthur, right?
MacArthur
Yes.
intentionally wove some Christian principles
Right.
entirely into the new Japanese
Yes.
Constitution.
Right. That's a very good point. I remember having a disagreement with my colleagues at Biola because she was saying that Japan's growth had nothing to do with Christianity and nothing to do with Christian principles. And I beg to differ with her, but I wish I'd had your ammunition at the time. I could have made a better case.
You also trace the same thing in Taiwan, and there's a wonderful book about it by K.T. Lee, Quoting Lee, who was for many, many years one of the top economics ministers of Taiwan, called The Economic Transformation of Taiwan, and he explains how Taiwan essentially did the same thing 50 years later, or 60 years later, that Japan had done in the 1880s and 90s, and how Christian understanding was woven into how Taiwan restructured its economy. But it was still not totally Christian.
Right.
Taiwan's economy was at the time still more controlled by government than we would think ought to be biblically. Still that influence.
Yeah, those are great examples. That's good. Thanks, Cal. Any other questions? I guess you've had enough of me, so I'll quit. Okay.
I would want to ask a question.
Yes, sir.
You rehearsed Say's law in a different way than what I'm accustomed to hearing it, and I'd like for you to go over it again, and if you would, expand a bit on what you said, and something that sort of leapt into my mind when you said it was, how do we even define commodities? Essentially, it seems that the way you enunciated Say's law was that you can't have an increase in demand for one commodity without an increase in the supply of another. But then I wondered, what are commodities? Are commodities material things? Is, for the producer of sirloin tip roasts, is the hunger of another person a commodity?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can give a completely satisfactory answer to that, but as far as Say's law is concerned, that was Say's main point, that because in economic exchange, somebody who wants to demand something from somebody else, the very simple point, has to produce something in exchange, and it could be a service or a physical commodity, whatever he has to offer somebody else that they might want. And because of this simple notion that massive overproduction is not possible in that type of system, what breaks Say's law is the banking system and the central bank. That's what causes Say's law not to work, and that's what fools a lot of people into thinking that it doesn't work. And as far as commodity, I think a person's hunger, I don't think I would define that as a commodity. I'm not sure I fully understand what you're saying. It's certainly a need, or we all need food, and it's like in economics we usually talk about wants rather than needs, because there's always an opportunity cost if you have to give something up. If you want something else. I'm not sure I fully appreciate what you're saying.
I'm wondering if one person's commodity, the beef farmers, might be another person's want, the hungry person's. And in fact, I even wonder, is it when we're looking constantly at relationships among the various commodities,
right?
I'm puzzled about how we can necessarily say that the demand for one commodity cannot rise without the supply of another commodity rising. What if instead the value of that other commodity in exchange rises though its supply doesn't? Then the the same supply of the other commodity can demand more of the one commodity. But I guess I'm looking too short, am I? Because the value of B isn't going to rise unless there is some rise in quantity in the ability of someone else to demand B.
Right. That's right. And without exchange, then you have to be your own supplier and demander at the same time. You have to supply all your needs and satisfy all your needs, and that's the whole purpose of exchange. So you don't have to do that.
If I could say something.
But maybe you could clarify.
The hungry person doesn't pay for his sirloin tips with his hunger.
Right.
Because hunger is irrelevant. It's not a commodity. Whatever he trades for the sirloin tips would be a commodity. His hunger is absolutely irrelevant.
Well, is it really irrelevant, or does it figure into his willingness to bear certain other opportunity costs?
It may matter.
Right.
But as far as the exchange goes, it's irrelevant.
Thanks for bailing me out, John. I couldn't answer his question. Go ahead. Yes. Yes,
One
sir.
other question, and that has to do with your remarks about minimum wage and the
Right.
impact on unemployment or on employment. The illustration that you referred to in the one article cited as indicating that, hey, you can have an increase in the minimum wage and actually have an increase in employment. First, it seems to me that as the illustration was written up, there was really a comparing of apples and oranges, because if you're going to compare businesses that once were not paying the minimum wage with businesses that are paying the minimum wage already, and then suddenly you take A and put it up to minimum wage, well, since supply tends to rise relative to demand, and the height of wage is communicative of demand, the supply of workers for those businesses that have indeed raised their wages is going to increase. That wouldn't seem to me to be anything contrary to the typical classical argument that an increase in the minimum wage will cause not an increase in aggregate unemployment, but rather a shift of employment from the less skilled to the more skilled, from those who can't earn their wage to those who can.
Yeah, that's exactly, what you're doing is you're talking about the interpretation of the results, and you can interpret the results any way you want, and that's one way you could interpret them. Then there was further. I didn't go into all the detail. There was further articles after the Kruger article that tried to refute them and said their analysis was wrong, and this was wrong, and they should have done this, and it's not really inconsistent. But that's the whole problem with the whole empirical game. It just goes on and on. But the Congress, they want to raise the minimum wage, so they only pick out what they want to hear. So they'll focus on Kruger's article because he tells them what they want to hear. And but it's an endless thing that goes on in journals. It never reaches any conclusion about anything, and then until somebody else comes out with an article that refutes all the rest of them, and then it goes back the other way, and it just never quits.
Thank you, Ron. Ron commented to me privately that he had the same what shall we say, concern that Jack had, as he talked about last night. Jack talked about going into a bookstore and trying to keep up with what the latest thing is in psychology and motivational books and all of this. And Ron said he had the same compulsion about academic journals. You have to keep up with what the latest article